I think that we talk a lot about the idea of the supernatural. And when we talk about the supernatural, we tend to think of things as being magical or mystical in some way. And, I can understand why we have a tendency to do this. However, I don't think that necessarily that's the case. When I look at the idea of the human soul, I believe that there is more to time-space than 3 spatial dimensions plus time. And, of course, some theories would support this idea. For example, in string theory, I believe there's a total of 11 dimensions.
Okay, with the benefit of anybody who hasn't watched part 1, this is my response to Michael, Rational Roundtable channel. He's just highlighted the basis of his argument against the arguments I've made against the soul. The first thing I would say, Michael, and I apologise if some of my views are a little bit sketchy or out of perhaps the ultimate order. As I said before, this is a new idea, one I haven't come across, and I've only had a few ideas to really think about it and think about the implications of it. Okay, the first thing is your suggestion that the supernatural does not necessarily mean magical or mystical. Absolutely couldn't agree more. There are many things that we regard as we've absorbed into naturalistic science now, radioactivity for example, which before they were discovered you would have to regard as supernatural. They were outside of naturalistic science. That's all the term means. I accept that. Now, you discuss these extra dimensions. This is what you're saying it is, basically, is this is extra dimension, and that's where the soul is stored. That's the implication you're making. I notice you talk about string theory, you talk about extra dimensions. I look on your channel, I see you've read Brian Greene's book, The Elegant Universe, which of course is all to do with string theory and associated theories. So I know where you're coming from, you know where I'm coming from. We're probably on about the same level with our understanding of string theory, which probably isn't very high. In fact, even if you devoted decades to string theory, I don't think your level's exactly that high. Nobody seems to quite get their head around all these things. The interesting thing is, having read one of Brian Greene's books myself, The Fabric of the Cosmos, the point he makes again and again is how small these dimensions are, how curled up tightly these dimensions are. They are millions and millions of times smaller than the smallest things that we can detect. This is the problem. This at present is the intractable problem in string theory, is that you can't prove these dimensions because they are so very small. The problem is that these dimensions don't suit your purposes. You require a much more loosely curled dimension for it to be able to interact with our brains, to be able to fulfill the function that you are suggesting. The problem is, if you asked any of these string theorists, I'm sure they would say to you, great, if you give me some loosely curled dimensions such as that, I will be able to help you to detect them. I'm suggesting I will be able to help you. I am suggesting I can help you detect them via inference if you make them large enough for me to have some impact on the brain. I'm going to return to that point later, but before I do, I just want you to carry on a little bit more with what you're saying.
Excuse me. I think the soul is a natural material part of us that we simply cannot see or detect at this point.
Okay, but the reason I wanted to play this short clip of yours is because of what you're suggesting here. You're suggesting that the brain, and by implication all matter, operates regularly within this extra dimension, and yet it's entirely undetectable. And yet it's entirely detectable because the extra dimensions of the brain are detecting it. These two things don't mate up. It's very much like the dualistic control issue that I felt I had to clarify earlier, and this stealth bomber example. However stealthy you make this extra dimension, if it's interacting with the other dimensions, which it must be doing for the parts of our brains that we're aware of to detect it, then it is, by inference, detectable. This is the problem. And so that's why I felt the need to clarify this earlier about duality and this stealth bomber example. It's not gone away. That argument has not gone away. And it's relevant in a slightly different way, but it's relevant to the case you're giving me, just as it was relevant to the idea of an immaterial, spiritual soul. I now want to discuss the principle of conservation of energy and how that impacts on it. But first, I'd just like to play another clip from your video.
However, I think that it is entirely possible, for example, if there was a fourth spatial dimension, if I was to move an object even a fraction of an inch in that fourth spatial dimension, it would be completely undetectable to us, to the three spatial dimensions we know of, height, width, and depth. Something in the fourth spatial dimension would be completely invisible and undetectable to everything we know. But it could be every bit as material as anything that we see in the world around us, and could in fact impact the world around us if connected to us.
Okay, well, with regard to this idea of yours, Michael, this is the point that I dispute the most. Not the bit you say at the end about it being just as materially sound as all the other dimensions. I accept that. It's totally materialistic. It's the idea that we won't be able to detect this dimension, that if there's a movement within this dimension, we won't be able to detect it. I am claiming that we will be able to detect it through inference. We wouldn't if it was these string theoretical dimensions that are millions and millions of times smaller than anything that we can detect. We wouldn't be able to then. But if it's large enough to have an impact, I think we would. Let me show you why I think we could. This is my model of the Earth, okay? It's actually a marble. If Coughlin's watching this, he'll be having a fit by now, because I've seen his response to Venom Fang X when he did the same thing. But this isn't plasticine, this is a marble. And I want you to imagine this is a marble Earth, and it's going around the sun. Okay, now we know that the Earth has a certain amount of energy as it goes around the sun, kinetic energy I'm talking about, and that kinetic energy is conserved. Okay, the Earth's vector changes, doesn't it? Its velocity changes. The energy remains the same, but the energy, at one point the energy is all in that dimension, and then at another point it's all in another dimension, but the energy is conserved. It transfers, if you like, if you want to put it that way, from dimension to dimension, but it is conserved in this two-dimensional plane. But at the moment we're looking at it in a plane like that. What I want to do is to hide one of those dimensions and see what happens. So I'm going to rotate it like that, okay? So let me rotate it. Okay? Still doing the same movement, but to you it doesn't appear as the same movement. I'm really struggling to talk and do this at the same time, so I think I'm going to stop. What it appears to you to be is a simple sinusoidal movement. Okay, now if I attached a spring to a fulcrum and gave it that simple sinusoidal movement, it would be fine. At this point it would have the minimum kinetic energy and the maximum stored energy in that spring, wouldn't it? And at this point it would all be kinetic energy. Kinetic energy will be the whole kit and caboodle. There will be no stored energy, and gradually you'd have this transfer of energy, and the conservation of energy would make sense. But we haven't got a spring. All we can see is the Earth slowing down for no apparent reason, and then speeding up, gaining energy, and then losing energy, and then gaining energy, then losing energy in this sinusoidal way. We can infer from that we're missing something. In this case, we're missing a dimension. We're viewing it that way on, and we need to turn around. So this is the point I'm making to you. You know, this is the conservation of energy was an argument that you didn't mention that I mentioned, but I mentioned in my other video. And the reason I mentioned it is because I said if you had a spiritual soul and a material soul, it would refute the principle of conservation of energy, because it would be impacting on the material world, which requires energy, and yet the spiritual soul wouldn't have any energy. Or if it did have energy, it would be transferring that energy and would be able to detect the extra energy it was transferring. Energy would be appearing from nowhere. Now, your example is a little bit different from that. I'm not suggesting it defeats the principle, it refutes the principle, it does away with the principle of the conservation of energy. No, what I'm saying is if it existed, if this large fourth dimension existed, we wouldn't have a principle of conservation of energy. We wouldn't see energy as being conserved, because all the times, every time we looked at things, there would be phasing in and out of this extra dimension, just the same as when this goes round here. Some of its energy and some of its momentum, the conservation of momentum as well, some of its momentum will be changing from one of our three dimensions to this fourth dimension and back again. So we wouldn't even have a principle of conservation of energy or momentum. In fact, it would only be once we'd figured in this fourth dimension that we'd actually realise that there was such a thing as the principle of conservation of energy. So by the fact that we we're talking about whether we can infer the existence of this extra dimension. My suggestion to you is that if there was this extra dimension, we would be able to infer it, because we would not have a principle of the conservation of energy. We would not have the principle of the conservation of momentum if we had a large fourth dimension. A fourth dimension large enough to be able to do the things that you would like it to do. Okay. I now want to carry on from that, because we're going to now start to look at some of the other things, because, well, let me play another clip from you. We'll take it from there.